morning, everybody, and welcome to our second class. This is Bradbury for Christian Humanism, and I hope you guys are all doing well. I am going to try something a little bit different here than I've normally done. I want to give you some slides, and I believe that this is going to record okay, but I'm not absolutely positive. So I might go ahead and test this for a little bit and then take a break and come back and we'll see where we're at. But I'm not sure if I'm showing up on the screen or not. All I can tell right now is that I have at least one slide up out of 59. It's just a little too many, but hopefully we can get to some of that. So anyway, once again, this is Christian Humanism. This is our second class since we started this week being online. I hope all of you are doing well. Hope you were able to watch that first lecture that I had. So I am actually recording this. This is March 25th. And some of you may remember this is the day that the ring was destroyed in The Lord of the Rings. And now you all know that, even if you did not know that before, with Gollum's greed biting off the finger of Frodo. So it's always a great day. And traditionally, March 25th was always the day that Easter was celebrated too, until we got to a relatively new liturgical calendar, at least in the West. So it was celebrated on March 25th. Not accidental then that Frodo and company leave Rivendell on December 25th, Christmas, and destroy the ring on March 25th, Easter. Pretty cool. Tolkien knew what he was doing. But anyway, you shouldn't actually be watching this until tomorrow. So I'm getting it done today so that you can watch it during class time tomorrow. So even though I'm recording this on March 25th, it is really for March 26th that this class is for. So our second of this week. God bless everybody. I hope you guys are all doing well. And, craziness. It's actually warmer today than it has been. We had snow when I recorded the other day. Now it's supposed to get up to 56 or 57 today. Went for a long walk. I'm not totally sure I'm supposed to be doing that with the governor's orders, but I'm not sure I care either. So I went for a very long walk yesterday, and his town just looks deserted. It's like living in a post-apocalyptic town, which I suppose is appropriate since we're going to be talking about science fiction, post-apocalyptic literature, fantasy, and what you have, Canticle for Leibowitz, today. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. So today we're going to talk about science fiction. And there are a lot of reasons. If you remember when I was going through the 5 non-leftist schools of thought on Tuesday, for me recording it 2 days ago, but for you watching it yesterday, when we talked about that, I gave you those 5 schools of thought, and the last school of thought was the school called fabulism. And it may seem a little strange at first blush that we would allow for fabulism to be this kind of school in and of itself, but that's what I want to explore today and think about. Why would we allow science fiction and fantasy, or what we now call science fiction and fantasy, why would we allow that to be this kind of school of thought? And let me give you just a little bit of background here so if you guys can see the slides, and I hope this is all working well. But you're thinking in particular about one form of science fiction, in particular dystopia, which is probably the most literary form of science fiction. We see all kinds of things going on in science fiction that we can see that it's spreading out into all kinds of different realms. So if you look at my screen there for a moment, you have everything from the Martian Chronicles, Kurt Vonnegut's Mother Night, J. Neil Schulman's Alongside Night, there's Canticle for Leibowitz, you have right there a Philip K. Dick novel, here an Ira Levin novel, That Hideous Strength, The Stand by Stephen King, but you also have some other forms of media in here as well. So some graphic novels such as The Dark Knight Returns from Frank Miller right here, or over here, V for Vendetta. They both came out at the same time. Dark Knight Returns and V for Vendetta came out in the 1980s, both really important for understanding who and what we are. Or Batman 100, a more recent graphic novel. But we've got Chesterton, and then then we've got albums too, Rush, 2112, or Muse, or the Flower Kings, or The Tangent, uh, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So we're going to see that these ideas of dystopia and science fiction really do kind of spread out into a whole number of different things. Radiohead, Kid A, uh, again, just incredible stuff, different ways of thinking about what's going on, or The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. There, I tried to put a whole number of things together. One of my favorite bands, Cosmograph, there with their album Capacitor, Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, a novel and then a movie, Father Elijah by Michael O'Brien. So a number of different ways that we can really look at science fiction, and it spreads out into albums, it spreads out into fiction, it spreads out into movies. And so we've seen probably more than any other manifestation of popular culture, science fiction has grown immensely over the last 100 years. And yet, we've not always been able to agree about what science fiction really is. C.S. Lewis, who would be one of the most important figures in terms of science fiction, said that literary critics were basically, who would dismiss science fiction, have not yet risen to the level of eunuchs boasting of their chastity. Now that I read that out loud, I'm actually a little embarrassed by that. I had promised that these lectures would be G and PG. That one's getting very close to PG-13, but still pretty funny, actually. And thinking about Lewis, of course, who was one of the great proponents early on of science fiction, and take one of the great historians of science fiction and also a writer of science fiction, Brian Aldiss, in his Billion-Year Spree, The True History of Science Fiction, writes, with the possible exception of Huxley, C.S. Lewis was the most formidable and respected champion of science fiction the modern genre has known. And that all came from his space trilogy, from Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and then That Hideous Strength. And I would say it's not just Lewis. So here we have Aldous, saying that it would be Huxley and Lewis. I agree with that, but I think you could also throw in Orwell, and you could also throw in, very importantly, Ray Bradbury. And I would actually say, if you wanted to find the two most prominent figures in science fiction who make science fiction legitimate, it would be C.S. Lewis and Ray Bradbury. Very, very similar in their kind of optimistic look, similar in their understanding of man, and very similar in their approach to story. But we'll talk about that in a little more in a little bit. So what is it about science fiction that makes it its own school of non-leftist thought? And what I want to suggest here is that even when science fiction is leftist, and it can be leftist, I mean, one of the most amazing things about science fiction is that you can explore almost anything you want. So if you want to look at what it would be like to live under a fascist society, you can write science fiction. If you want to look at what it would be like to live under a communist society, you can write science fiction. You could either do that from the pro standpoint or the con standpoint. Science fiction really allows for you to explore almost anything you want. If you want to envision, as several science fiction authors have, what it would be like to live in an utterly free, libertarian, anarchist society, you can do it. You can look at the works of, say, Werner Vinge, who has done exactly that, and looking at what corporations might be like thousands of years from now, after they've developed certain genetic understandings of things and have really developed and honed their technology and allowed us to become human beings in ways that we might not even recognize at this point. And yet those things are becoming reality when we consider what genetic engineering can do, assuming we all get past this plague, of course, which we will. But assuming that we can do that and get back to normal life, we'll start speculating again about what we can do and what we can't do, and what the limitations are and what the possibilities are. In one of my favorite articles written in the 20th century, Ray Bradbury's Day After Tomorrow, Why Science Fiction, which was published in the May 2nd, 1953 issue of The Nation, Bradbury had just published not only Fahrenheit 451, but also the Martian Chronicles. And so it was a big deal. And he was making science fiction respectable. And the Nation asked him to describe, well, what do you mean by science fiction? What is this genre? And basically, this article is what solidifies the term science fiction as science fiction. Before that, it was called speculative fiction or scientific fiction. There were a number of different names that were given to science fiction, but the term science fiction actually became that term right around 1952 and 1953, one we still accept to this day. He says, "There's great serious fun for the writer in asking himself, when does an invention stop being a reasonable escape mechanism? For we must all evade the world and its crushing responsibilities from time to time, and start being a dangerous device. How much of any one such invention is good for a person, bad for a person, maybe fine for this man, but fatal to the next? So much depends, of course, on what the individual hears when he gives himself over to the electronic tides breaking on the shore of his seashell. The voice of conscience and reason, an echo of morality, a new thought, a fresh idea, a morsel of philosophy, or bias, hatred, fear, prejudice, nightmare, half-truths, lies, and suspicions, or perhaps even worse, the sound of one emptiness strikingly hollowly against yet another and another emptiness, broken at 2-minute intervals by a jolly commercial, preferably in rhymed quatrains or couplets. Right? All of these things are possible in science fiction. We have to ask these questions. And it means that science fiction is always the literature of what is possible, of what is probable, what is impossible, what is improbable, what our abilities are, and what our limits are. But that also means, by considering science fiction is always a genre of free will. If we make this choice, what new choices present themselves? And if we follow that choice, what new choices present themselves? What if we step back from our choices and we go a completely different way? We can follow all of these various paths of choices over and over and over again in science fiction. And really, it means that the genre is limitless. We can do anything. We can explore our inner self. We can explore our genes, or we can explore any planet, any world. We can look at anything with science fiction. We can go to any place or any time. We can go anywhere in science fiction." Bradbury continues in this 1953 article. "In writing a science fiction story around such an idea, the author must consider many things. Is there, for instance, a delicate interplay where the society does not crush the individual, but where the individual realizes without his cooperation, society would fly to pieces through the force of anarchy? Is the programming on such an ear button receiver of a caliber to enable a man to be a gyroscope, both taking from and giving to society, perhaps beautifully balanced? Does it tell him what to do every hour and every minute of every day? Or, fearing knowledge of any sort, tell him nothing and spoon feed him mush? The challenge and the fun come in handling all of the above ideas and materials in such a way as to predict how perversely or how well man will use himself, and therefore his mechanical extensions at the coming times of our lives. It is both exciting and disconcerting for a writer to discover the man's machines are indeed symbols of his own most secret cravings and desires, extra hands put out to touch and reinterpret the world. The machines themselves are the empty gloves into which a hand, either cold and excessively bony or warm, full-fleshed and gentle, can be inserted. The hand is always the hand of man, and the hand of man can be good or evil, while the gloves themselves remain immoral." perfect Bradbury in an understanding of who and what we are and trying to figure out what is it that our own inventions can do for us. For the problem of good and evil fascinates then, especially when it is to be found externalized and purified into the thousands of semi-robots we are using and will use in the coming century. Our atomic knowledge destroys cancer, or it can destroy men. Our airplanes can carry passengers, or jellied gasoline bombs. The hairline, the human, choice is there. Before us today we see the aluminum and steel and uranium chess pieces, which the interested science fiction player can hope to move about, trying to guess how man will play out the game. And it is always a game of free will. What do we do with our will? What do we do with the choices that we have made and the choices that will be created and come from that in the future? This, I think, should answer why I have more often than not written stories which for a convenient label are called science fiction, Bradbury continues. There are a few literary fields, it seems to me, that deal so strikingly with themes that concern us all today. There are few more exciting genres. There are none fresher or so full of continually renewed and renewable concepts. It is, after all, the fiction of ideas, the fiction where philosophy can be tinkered with, torn apart, and put back together again. It is the fiction of sociology and psychology and history, compounded and squared by time. It is the fiction where you may set up and knock down your own political and religious and moral states. It can be a high form of Swiss watchmaking. It can be poetry. It has resulted in some of the greatest writing in our past, from Plato to Thomas More, to Swift, to Kepler, to Poe, to Bellamy, to Orwell. If you try to cram philosophical and sociological theories into the non-science fiction tale, you more often than not will wind up with a mere crust than filling. It takes a very agile writer indeed to keep a book together under such conditions. But in the story of prediction, at its best, you are given leave to act out your problem in easily stage-managed symbols, in allegories if you wish. It isn't necessary to stop for long-winded explanations or philosophical or sociological climates. Simply by showing your real characters living and dying against your fresh background, the reader can guess an entire and different world, can feel it come alive through an osmotic literary process, which is often exceptionally subtle. Science fiction, then, does one of the favor of making outsized images of problems so they can be seen and handled along all sides like those of Easter balloons strung along the avenue at Macy's every year. Over and above everything, the writer in this field has a sense of being confronted by dozens of paths that move along the thousand mirrors of a carnival maze, seeing his society imaged and re-imaged and distorted by the light thrown back at him, without moving anything but his typewriter, that immensely dependable time machine. Think about that. Your word processor, that immensely movable time machine. The writer can take those paths and examine those billion images. Where are we going? Well, first, let us see where we've been, and let us ask ourselves what we are at this very hour. Fortified with this knowledge, nebulous at most, the writer's imagination selects the first path. Love that. Bradbury, of course, is an American original. He's one of us. He could easily fit into this course on Christian humanism. Even though he himself was not a practicing Christian, he was raised an Episcopalian, struggled with his faith all of his life, and ultimately decided that there probably was something profound out there. I don't think he would have ever imagined exactly what we might call the Trinitarian God, but he had an immense respect for the divine, and especially as imagined through the human person and through human challenge, through human witness. This is in the delight of all of his short stories. Nobody really creates wonder and delight better than Bradbury could. I think he's truly an American original. He is one of our greats, and we have certain scholars in this world who have done just amazing work with Bradbury, and how could we not? I mean, Bradbury is endlessly fascinating. He was endlessly fascinated about everything, and therefore, in his own love, in his own writing, he gives us a sense of what is most important and what we should pursue. And it doesn't matter if we're reading one of his short stories, or if we're reading Fahrenheit 451, or Something Wicked This Way Comes, or Dandelion Wine, or Who Killed Constance. All of these various books, Martian Chronicles that Bradbury wrote, he wrote with an immense delight, and you can feel that joy. You can feel that immeasurable joy in every word that he put on paper. So, once again, I want us to think about the very history of science fiction and where it comes from. And before we do that, and especially before we get into the heart of Canticle for Leibowitz, I want to define a couple of terms. The first term that I want to define is utopia. Utopia is, of course, a language that goes back to Plato, is a word that goes back to Plato, and it means a perfect place, and ironically, therefore, it means nowhere. There is no such place as utopia, and that's one of the great ironies of what a utopia is. By the very fact it's perfect, it cannot exist, at least not in this realm. The second term is a term that everybody at Hillsdale should be very familiar with, and that is the term republic, res publica. That is the common good, or the good thing, the thing around which we work, our common weal, our commonwealth. It is, of course, by very definition, the opposite of utopia. Right? Instead of utopia, where everything is perfect, in a republic, it is always based on tension, the tension between various balances and struggles and conflicts, the differences, the minute little things that make us unique all play a role in the republic. And if utopia seeks equality, the republic seeks excellence, something that is individual to each one of us and therefore unrepeatable in each one of us. And then we get to a term that we don't use very often anymore. And I think it's unfortunate that we don't. But this term called cockatopia, this was actually the first word that we used, as you can see here, as I have up on the slide, going back to 1715. This was the first word in English that meant something like a dysfunctional society, something in which we're ruled by maybe Hobbes's Leviathan or by the Mammon of Jeremy Bentham. That word, however, would not be used again until 1817. But cockatopia is not quite dystopia. Dystopia tends to be specifically about a Leviathan gone wrong, whereas cockatopia can be about almost anything that's gone wrong and become disproportionate in society. And then we jump forward again, and we get to the term dystopia, first used, as I have listed here, in 1878, but then out of the English language until 1952. And all of our current usage of dystopia, and that's stunning when you think about it. Imagine walking into Barnes & Noble. You can't do that right now because of this idiotic plague. But imagine when the plague is done and you walk back into Barnes & Noble and you walk into, say, the young adult section. Would not almost every book in the YA section be dystopia? We're obsessed with the idea of dystopia, and I actually think that's a very healthy thing in society. In fact, I think it's one of the healthiest things that's come about in Western civilization over the last 100 years, but especially over the last really 60-some years, since 1952, I guess coming up on 70 years, isn't it? The last 68 years. This idea of dystopia and the dysfunction of what happens in modern totalitarian despotic societies. And then here is a fifth term, one that was coined by Margaret Atwood. And she says, because there is no such thing as utopia, and really there's no total thing as dystopia, because both of those imply a kind of absolutism. Utopia where everything is perfect, or dystopia where everyone is miserable. She says utopia, mixing those two, is a better word because by doing so, we acknowledge that within societies that are dysfunctional, there are always those who benefit from the dysfunction. Think about the Communist Party in Moscow during the Soviet Union. Right? 99 out of 100 people were absolutely oppressed and struggling and often in fear of their life during the reign of the Soviet Union. But you always had that little 1% or less who were living off everybody else and living as high as anyone has ever lived in history. And so what Margaret Atwood tries to explain is that in societies, rarely do we have a complete utopia or a complete dystopia, but rather we have this kind of balance of things. And so, as she says, but you scratch the surface a little and, or so I think, you see something more like a yin and yang pattern. Within each utopia, a concealed dystopia. Within each dystopia, a hidden utopia, if only in the form of the world as it existed before the bad guys took over. And that's one reason, and I absolutely admire Margaret Atwood, especially for The Handmaid's Tale. When you read The Handmaid's Tale, of course, the whole story is being written from the perspective of someone who has found a journal, an old journal, that details all of the hell that our heroine in the Handmaid's Tale is experiencing. But the only reason that that journal can be analyzed is because that evil dystopia or utopia has fallen apart, and we're now in a normal society in which we can go back and study what has gone well before it. So the very fact that the story of dystopia exists after 1984, or after Brave New World, or after Fahrenheit 451, or after The Handmaid's Tale, is an indication that something went right at some point, or all of those records would have been destroyed. But we dig a little bit deeper in Atwood, and we ask the question then, well, what is it about dystopia and utopia that we have to think about what doesn't allow or does allow them to be extreme? And she gives us 3 reasons here. Why? Because number 1, perfection can never be attained. That is, it denies the struggle of human existence and individuality. 2, a vision of perfection is always limited to a single person or a group. Right? That one of those obvious things that we don't often make obvious. And 3, there is always provision made for the renegades within these societies. Those who don't or won't follow the rules, what do they have to suffer? Prison, enslavement, exile, exclusion, and execution. So these are always the downsides to this utopia. And yet Atwood says all dystopian, utopian literature does by its very nature have a signal of hope simply because those documents, that is, the stories themselves, have continued. Okay, so what else do we need to know? Things that you guys already know from the first half of the semester. Greek concepts necessary for the idea of story. Logos, right? The idea of thought, imagination, speech, word, right? Motion, coined by Heraclitus around 510 BC. Mythos, the idea of the human story involving the supernatural or the metaphysical, something that we understand but can't be explained, duplicated, replicated by mere fact, by fact alone. And finally, anamnesis, the ability to remember, to have a story told so that we can recognize what is good, what is bad, what needs to be learned, what needs to be relearned, what needs to be forgotten. That in anamnesis, to remember. So logos, that is the idea, mythos, the covering for the idea, and anamnesis, the remembering of the idea and the covering itself. So we might think of that as soul, person, and society, or we might think of that as idea, story, and remembrance, right? All of these things play a role, but logos, mythos, and anamnesis are all very important. Okay, we're about 30 minutes into the class. So I'm going to take a very quick break right now. And the reason I'm taking a break is I want to make sure that this is all recording properly And then we're going to come back. I'm not going to have the slides up. And we're just going to go straight to me talking to you about Ray Bradbury and then about A Canticle for Leibowitz. So it may be seamless to you, I hope, but I will see you in just a moment. Hey everyone, I'm back. Okay, it didn't do exactly what I thought it was going to do. It showed you the split screen there of the slides and what was coming up, but such is life. Hopefully that it won't distract you too much. But yeah, that's I didn't realize it would do that, but such is life. It was recording the way it was. So I hope that was okay and everybody was able to follow that. All right, so let's get back to science fiction. So you've got those terms. I want you to know those terms. You've seen them there on the screen. You have all of that. And maybe I can send those out to you as well, but you should be able to just grab them from the screen. But now I want to talk specifically about some examples of science fiction and how science fiction works, and look specifically at the idea of Bradbury and then Walter Miller with A Canticle for Leibowitz. So when I was putting together this course, and I've now been teaching this course in various forms since 2003, but when I was putting together this course specifically for this semester, I could not decide, and I went back and forth. I could not decide between using A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller or using Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. And I think either of them would fit just perfectly for what we're trying to do in Christian humanism. The reason I ultimately went with Walter Miller over Ray Bradbury was a very simple thing. Walter Miller was a practicing Christian, and Ray Bradbury was not. And since this is a course on Christian humanism, I gave the slight nod to Walter Miller over this. And yet, it doesn't quite fit. And I'll try and explain why here in a little bit. And yet it does. But as you can tell, if you can... if you can't tell, I'm conflicted about this still to this day, trying to think about which should I have done. But I hope that in your life, you all will have read by the end of the semester. If you haven't already, you all will have read, of course, Canticle for Leibowitz, because it's going to be on your final and you need to have read it. And it's a great book. I mean, it's a classic. It is one of the, if not the great classic of science fiction of the 20th century, certainly one of them. But I hope that you also get a chance in your lifetime to read Martian Chronicles. Martian Chronicles is a stunning examination of the human condition, and I think it is just masterful in the way that it tries to explain who and what we are, why we do the things we do, and what the limits of those things are and what the possibilities of those things are. It is, in and of itself, an examination of imperialism and everything that can go wrong with imperialism. The United States here is the imperial force taking over Mars. The Martians in the story, which we only really see at the beginning of the story, though they do make random appearances throughout the rest of the story, but they're mostly killed off by disease. The Martians represent a kind of mixture of a high classical culture, maybe the Greeks or the Romans, mixed with the American Indian tribes of North America. So there's something in them that is both representative of, say, the Sioux or the Lakota, the Cheyenne, or perhaps the Cherokee or the Choctaw or the Chickasaw, mixed with maybe the Athenians, the ancient Athenians. And that's part, Bradbury, of course, was incredibly well educated. And Martian Chronicles is an attempt to examine, well, what is the American condition like, and what is the role of imperialism? And Bradbury, again, would fit in very nicely with this class. Certainly, he does not believe in imperialism. He does not believe in the destruction of the human person, whatever that human person's accidents of birth might be. Bradbury is the great kind of anti-bigot of his day in all kinds of ways. He got in trouble for it, too, in a lot of trouble for it. I'll give you an example here. In the early 1950s, right after Bradbury had become very famous, Bradbury was a libertarian. hardcore libertarian, constitutionalist libertarian. I was a big fan of Albert J. Nock. Remember we talked about him that last class. He's a big fan of anarchism and the classical liberals. He reads them, he believes in them, he is one of them. Later, he will become a very close friend with Russell Kirk. In fact, their friendship is a vital friendship in the 20th century. But in the early 1950s, Bradbury, having become famous for Fahrenheit 451 and Martian Chronicles, takes out a full-page ad against Joe McCarthy and against HUAC, that is the House on Un-American Activities Committee. These people who were trying to find traitors everywhere in the United States. And Bradbury said this isn't the way to go about it. The way to go about finding traitors is to let everybody, in a very Jeffersonian fashion, speak their mind. And then when the traitor emerges, you combat them by arguing with them, by making the public realize how dangerous they are. The last thing you want to do is drive a totalitarian person underground, where they have no ability to unleash that anger or that belief in totalitarianism except through violence, because they become so frustrated. Bradbury was an extreme opponent of free speech, and he said quite openly in not only his newspaper ads, but also in public hearings, that he would defend the amendments of the U.S. Constitution more than anything else in the world, and that he would live and die by those amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And the FBI started a file and an investigation of Ray Bradbury, saying in the files, and you can look all of this up, this is all now, it's been declassified. So you can go onto the FBI archives and look up Ray Bradbury, and you find the snitches who wrote in and basically said, Bradbury is such a proponent of the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights that he almost likely is a communist sympathizer. Now, just let that sink in for a moment. He loves the 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution so much that he must be a commie. What on God's green earth was the FBI thinking? It's just bizarre. And you have Bradbury, who is the most pro-American in the sense of understanding who and what we are. This is a Coolidge, Harding kind of guy, right? This is a George Washington, Thomas Jefferson kind of guy. And you got the FBI investigating him as possibly being a communist because he's so pro-American. If you can't see me right now, if you're just listening to this, I'm giving the dumbfounded look. There, that's my dumbfounded look. I mean, really, what is going on here? This is just amazing. But Bradbury could be very critical. There's no doubt about that. He could be extremely critical. So in his novel, in the Martian Chronicles, he presents this story of imperialism and all of these expeditions going to Mars and unwittingly putting human disease throughout the Martians and killing the vast majority of Martians. But we have this great moment, a disturbing moment, but a great moment in the story. And for those of you who are interested in looking at some point at the Martian Chronicles, it is the story entitled June 2001 and the Moon Be Still as Bright. It had originally appeared as a short story in 1948, but then makes its way into the Martian Chronicles. And it's about one of the men on one of the early expeditions who goes somewhat crazy because he identifies with the with the Martians. It's very similar, if any of you have ever seen the movie, and it's a movie that is equally wonderful and ridiculous at the same time, called Dances with Wolves, where the main character, John Dunbar, goes native. That is, he begins to sympathize and then completely sympathize with the American Indian. This is what happens in the Martian Chronicles from 1950, when we have one of these characters sympathizing with the Martians and his captain has to chase after him. Ask me then if I believe in the spirit of things as they were used, and I'll say yes. They're all here. All the things which had uses, all the mountains which had names, and we'll never be able to use them again without feeling uncomfortable. And somehow the mountains will never sound right to us, We'll give them new names, but the old names are there, somewhere in time. Those mountains were shaped and seen under old names. The names we'll give to the canals and mountains and cities will fall like so much water on the back of a mallard. No matter how much we touch Mars, we'll never really touch it. And then we'll get mad at it. And you know what we'll do? We'll rip it up. We'll rip the skin right off and we'll change it to fit ourselves. We're not going to ruin Mars, said the captain. It's too big, it's too good to ruin. Oh, you think not? We Earthmen have a talent for ruining big, beautiful things. The only reason we didn't set up a hot dog stand in the midst of the Egyptian temple of Karnak is because it was out of the way and it served no commercial purpose. And Egypt is a small part of Earth. But here, this whole thing is ancient and different, and we have to set down somewhere and start fouling it up. We'll call the canal Rockefeller Canal, and the mountain King George Mountain, and the sea the DuPont Sea, and there will be Roosevelt and Lincoln and Coolidge cities, and it won't ever be right. And then there are the proper names for those things, the proper names for those places. Well, that's your job, the captain says, as archaeologists to find out the old names, and we'll make use of them. A few men like us against all the commercial interests in the world? Spender looked at the Iron Mountains. They know we're here tonight to spit in their wine. I imagine the Martians hate us. The captain shook his head. There's no hatred here. He listened to the wind. From the look of their cities, they were a graceful, beautiful, philosophical people. They accepted what came to them. They acceded to racial death. That much we know. And without a last-moment war of frustration to tumble down their cities. Every town we've seen so far has been flawlessly intact, and they probably don't mind us being here any more than they mind children playing on their lawn. Knowing and understanding children for what they are, in any way, perhaps all of this will change us for the better. Well, the classic argument between the imperialist and the non-imperialist. And Bradbury nails it so beautifully, so philosophically, and so poetically in that passage. All right, let me read one last thing from Bradbury, and then we'll turn for the remainder of our class to the Canticle for Leibowitz. Towards the end of his life, and in an article that really would have fit very nicely with the article I was reading from earlier, Why Science Fiction, in an article towards the end of his life, and in an homage to his good friend Russell Kirk, he wrote a piece called On the Shoulders of Giants, right? Why do we see? We see because we stand on the shoulders of giants. That's why we see farther than every generation before us. But Bradbury asks, what is it that science fiction really is? And he says, truly, it is the history of ideas. The children would never have said so in so many words. They only sensed it and read it and loved it. The kids sensed, if they could not speak of it, that the first science fiction writers were the cavemen who were trying to figure out the first sciences, which were what? How to capture fire. What to do about the lout of a mammoth hanging around the outside of the cave. How to play dentist to the saber-toothed tiger and turn him into the house cat. Pondering these problems and possible sciences, the first cavemen and women drew science fiction dreams on their cave walls, scribbles in soot, blueprinting, possible strategies. Illustrations of mammoths, tigers, fires, but what to solve? How to turn science fiction, which is really another way for saying problem solving, into science fact. That is, the problem solved. Some few brave men ran out of that cave to be stomped by the mammoth, toothed by the tiger, scorched by the bestial fire that lived on in trees and devoured the woods. Some few finally returned to draw on the walls the triumph of the mammoth, knock like a hairy cathedral to earth, the tiger toothless and the fire tamed, and brought within the cave to light their own nightmares and warm their own souls. The children sensed, if they could not speak, that the entire history of mankind is the history of problem solving. Science fiction, swallowing ideas, digesting them, and execrating formulas for survival. You can't have one without the other. No fantasy, there's no reality. No studies concerning loss, you will never have gain. No imagination, you will never have free will. No impossible dreams, you will never have solutions. The children sensed, if they could not, that fantasy is its robot, child science fiction. It is not an escape, but a circling round to reality to enchant and to make believe. Not make believe, but to make it believe. What is an airplane after all but a circling of reality, an approach to gravity which says, look, with my magic machine, I defy you. Gravity, be gone. Distance, stand aside. Time, stand still. Or reverse, as I finally outrace the sun around the world in, by God, look, a plane, a jet, a rocket in 80 minutes. The children guessed, if they did not whisper, that all science fiction is an attempt to solve problems by pretending to look the other way. In another place, I have described this literary process as Perseus confronting Medusa, gazing at Medusa's image in his bronze shield, pretending to look one way. Perseus reaches back over his shoulder and severs the head. So science fiction pretends at futures in order to cure sick dogs lying in today's road. Indirection is everything. Metaphor is medicine. And so what do we understand? On top of which, I have already mentioned, the young people have tossed bombs into the nearest corner art gallery, your downtown art museum. They have walked through the halls and dozed off at the modern scene as represented by 60-odd years of abstraction, self-abstracting itself into vanished-up backsides. These are empty canvases of modern art, because modern art is nothing but empty minds with no concept, sometimes not even a color. Now modern art could even interest a performing flea at a dog circus. And the children said, enough. Let there be fantasy. Let there be science fiction. Let illustration be reborn. Let the pre-Raphaelites reclone themselves and proliferate. And it was so. And because the children of the space age and the sons and daughters of Tolkien wanted their fictional dreams sketched and painted in illustrative terms, the ancient art of storytelling, as acted out by your caveman, or by your Frau Angelico, or by your Dante, was reinvented as yet the second giant pyramid turned end for end, and an education ran from the base into the apex, and the old order was reversed. Hence your double revolution in reading, in teaching literature, and in pictorial art. Hence, by osmosis, the Industrial Revolution and the electric and the space ages have finally seeped into the blood, the bone, the marrow, the heart, the flesh, and the mind of the young, who as teachers teach us what we have known all along. They teach us that truth again, that all of this is the history of ideas, which is all that science fiction has ever been about. And it always is inventing the same dream, the same idea that has yet to be born in refantasizing in fantasy, in fascinating shapes and forms, some of them permanent and all of them promising. Every single idea is about survival. I love Bradbury. That guy just captures what is the best of humanity. He nails it. Okay, so for the remainder of our class, what is this insane book, A Canticle for Leibowitz? What is this book about by Walter Miller? This book, in sum, is Augustinian theology and philosophy. This is the greatest example of theological science fiction. Nobody has bested this. I'm not sure anyone will ever mix theology with science fiction as well as Walter Miller does. There are others who come really, really close. But this is still the greatest of all of those. It is a hilarious novel. It is a disturbing novel. It is a thoughtful novel. It is a novel that makes us question all of our basic assumptions. And even though Walter Miller was a devout Catholic, and I'm going to talk about that, his story ends rather tragically. In fact, his whole story is a tragedy. As a young man, born into a kind of non-religious, quasi-Protestant family in the South, he had really no religion as he went into World War II. Going into World War II, he has no great philosophy of life, but he's firmly convinced of the American cause, as he should have been. And he becomes a tail gunner on the back of a bomber. And the bomber that he's assigned to is specifically tasked with bombing Italy during the war. And it is his bomber that takes out the oldest of all monasteries in the West, Monte Cassino. He doesn't even really know what it is. But after the war, he comes back and he starts reading about all the things he had destroyed during the war. And he begins to feel immense guilt, but also immense attraction to what he had bombed and trying to figure out what it was. He wasn't attracted to the bombing, but to the thing that he had bombed. And he started reading about the monks at Monte Cassino. He started reading about early Christianity, and he converts to Catholicism, much to the chagrin of his family. But his story is still a tragedy. No matter how profoundly Catholic he tried to be, this was the only book he could ever get out. And he spent almost all of the remainder of his life after this book is published in 1959. He spends the remainder of his life from 1959 all the way up until his death in 1996 trying to write its sequel. And he becomes so frustrated in 1996 that he is incapable of writing its sequel that he commits suicide. It is a terrible, tragic story. But Walter Miller, in all kinds of ways, despite the fact he was a suicide, has my great sympathy. I still pray for him. I hope he made it. Who am I to judge? I don't know what his life was like. All I know is that this was a man who strove for excellence, failed, and took his own life because of it. So there are times, and if we were doing this class in person, I may not have told you that he committed suicide until after the discussion. But since we obviously can't have an actual discussion, you know it now. But it also means that once you know that, it's very hard to read the story in the same way. So Miller is trying here to figure out exactly what the church has meant to civilization. And so what he does, of course, is he gives us a whole series of stories, all of future time, which really could be past. So we find ourselves 600 years from now when we see Brother Francis. And then another 600 years from then, 1,200 years later, where we're in the middle of a Renaissance. And then another 600 years where we are now in the middle of a society just like ours. And of course, it ends in nuclear war yet again. So notice what Walter Miller is doing in a very Augustinian and very, very Greek fashion. He is giving us the idea of cycles and suggesting that maybe there is something within these cycles that can break us free from those cycles. And notice the only thing that is constantly there is the church. No matter what the cycles of civilization are, rise, fall, wherever it is, that church, the Abbey of Leibowitz, remains steady throughout all of it. And even at the very end, when the world is destroyed yet again in nuclear fire, we have this very bizarre, very, very bizarre second coming with the homeless woman and Rachel. It's just one of the weirdest, most disturbing scenes in all of literature. But then at the end, of course, all those priests get on that ship and they colonize. Now, we're to presume two things from the end of the novel. The cycles will keep going, but the church will remain as well. Now, if you're Roman Catholic, you might be thinking, wow, this is amazing that we have Catholic science fiction. You might equally be thinking, he is not kind to the church. And Miller is not kind to the church. I hope that is very clear. This is no rah-rah celebration of the Catholic Church. He is more than willing to look at its idiocies, at its flaws, at its contradictions. He understands that no matter how grace-filled the church might be, it still is an institution in this world, and therefore, because it is in this world, it will be deeply flawed. Now, there are a couple of really perplexing questions that go along with this story. Right? What do we find at the very beginning? Here we are somewhere in southern Utah or northern New Mexico. Probably we're about where Santa Fe is today. There are a lot of reasons to believe that this is Santa Fe, New Mexico, especially given that they're very close to the fallout shelter and maybe to the nuclear labs at Los Alamos. So we don't know exactly where this abbey is, but it probably is around what is now Santa Fe, New Mexico. And that's interesting because, of course, that plays so well into Death Comes for the Archbishop, that both of our novels take place into Santa Fe. But it's also, and very consciously a nod on Miller's part, it's also a nod to Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, where the one reservation in the world where you could be whatever you want as a native was in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So New Mexico in science fiction has often had this strange role as being a kind of safe haven from everything going on in the world. And you think about a place like Santa Fe, it's not exactly what you would think of as the perfect city. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. But if you're thinking about food production, for example, or you're thinking about rainfall, you would not choose Santa Fe as your ideal post-apocalyptic place, right? It's desert. And it's high desert, it's mountainous desert, but it's still desert. And you would really, really have to be very, very active during the winter to save enough of the snowfall to allow yourself to have water during the summer. Now, with modern irrigation, it's not a huge problem. It's still a problem, but it's not a huge problem. But this isn't a place that you can have constant rainfall all year and depend upon good soil and good rain. And yet there is something in the imagination about Santa Fe where we've seen civilizations going all the way back to the Pueblo and the Anasazi long before the Franciscan missionaries ever showed up or the Spanish showed up in Santa Fe. We know that that area around what's now Santa Fe has been occupied since the first American Indians ever showed up on North American soil. So what an interesting place of cultures and a variety of different elements of human society, and yet always that constant of human civilization right there at Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now, really, really interesting. So I want to turn to a couple of passages within Canticle for Leibowitz. And I'm just going to start on chapter 1, page 1. And we get here immediately this fascinating image and the whole kind of surrounding tapestry of what's happened here 600 years from now in this post-apocalyptic world. Brother Francis Gerard, Francis, of course, after St. Francis, Gerard after Gerard Manley Hopkins. Brother Francis Gerard of Utah might never have discovered the blessed documents had it not been for the pilgrim with girded loins who appeared during that young novice's Lenten fast in the desert. Never before had Brother Francis actually seen a pilgrim with girded loins. This one was the bona fide article. He was convinced as soon as he had recovered from the spine-chilling effect of the pilgrim's advent on the far horizon, as a wiggling iota of black caught in a shimmering haze of heat. Legless, but wearing a tiny head, the iota materialized out of the mere glaze on the broken roadway and seemed more to writhe than to walk into view, causing Brother Francis to clutch the crucifix of his rosary and mutter an Ave or two, right, the Hail Mary. The iota suggested a tiny apparition spawned by the heat demons who tortured the land at high noon, when any creature capable of the motion of the desert, except the buzzards. You guys remember how important the buzzards are. They're always the symbol of death and renewal. Except the buzzards and a few monastic hermits, such as Francis, lay motionless in its burrow or hid beneath a rock from the ferocity of the sun. Only a thing monstrous, a thing preternatural, or a thing that addled wits would hike purposefully down a trail at noon this way. Brother Francis added a hasty prayer to Saint Raoul, the Cyclopean, patron of the misborn, for protection against the saint's unhappy proteges. For who did not then know that there were monsters in the earth in those days? That which was born alive was by the law of the church and the law of nature suffered to live, and helped to maturity if possible by those who had begotten it. The law was not always obeyed, but it was obeyed with sufficient frequency to sustain a scattered population of adult monsters, who often chose the remotest of the deserted lands for their wanderings, where they prowled by night around the fires of the prairie travelers. But at last the iota squirmed its way out of the heat risers and into clear air, where it manifestly became a distant pilgrim. Brother Francis released the crucifix with a small amen. Okay, what an incredible, gripping opening to this novel. Here we have Brother Francis Gerard, who is educated but also a fool, who's out in the desert on some kind of fasting pilgrimage. It's Lent, how appropriate for what we're doing now. It's in a post-apocalyptic world, how appropriate for what's going on in the world. And somewhere he is between the shortest route between the Great Salt Lake and El Paso. So what do we know? We know that there's a broken highway. Was this the interstate? Maybe what would it be? I-25 going through here that this pilgrim is walking across. We're in the desert. He is praying to saints we've never heard of. Saint Raoul, the Cyclopean. I mean, I guarantee you, not one Catholic in our class woke up this morning and offered his day to the patronage of Saint Raoul by any means. And then, of course, we find out that Brother Francis has his own saint, Saint Leibowitz, which is not recognized by Rome. And then what do we get? We have the buzzards flying around. For those of you who've read the story, you know how terrible those buzzards are and what they signify. And yet then this pilgrim comes up, and what is he? Not at all what what Francis is expecting. We see this guy who comes up, and what does he say? He starts praying to the King of all, who maketh bread to spring forth from the earth. And he gives him a name. And all of this is in Hebrew. And Brother Francis is wondering, what kind of title is that? It's not Latin. It's not Greek, right? But he doesn't know that here comes, this is probably not politically correct in 2020, but it's so brilliant from a literary standpoint. Here comes the wandering Jew. The Jew who has been condemned to walk the earth because when Jesus came to his doorstep during the Passion, the Jew turned him away. And therefore, he was condemned to walk the earth. This is an old literary trope. He is condemned to walk the earth for the rest of his days until the second coming. And so what do we have in this Jew, sometimes called Old Benjamin, goes by different names? Notice it is not only the Abbey of Leibowitz that is in every one of these stories, but the Jew shows up as well. The 2 points of history, no matter what the cycles, the Augustinian Greek cycles are, no matter what those cycles are, there are 2 things that can utterly be relied upon: the continuation of the Jewish people and the Christian church. Nothing else, nothing is trustworthy over time. No government, no corporation, no community outside of the Jewish people and the Christian religion. Now just imagine that for a moment. And I apologize for the politically incorrect element of it being the wandering Jew. But what a great story. Incredible story, right? These 2 things maintain our civilization. The Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian. Now we're focused on the Judeo-Christian. But there's still the Greco-Roman, which is interesting. The Abbey has kept it alive. And what do we find? And For those of you who've not read the whole novel yet, I apologize. I'm going to give a lot away. But what do you find? What is the great paradox that's going on? And why is it that Miller is both praising the church and mocking it at the same time, or at least mocking parts of it? What is he doing here? Well, Leibowitz is almost certainly the Wandering Jew, and the Wandering Jew is almost certainly Leibowitz. So we have the Wandering Jew who is always around Los Alamos, right? The remains. Think about it, he needed to get pastrami and bagels, right? Very classic Jewish food. He needed to get pastrami and bagels. His name is Leibowitz. He is supposedly murdered by the mob. We are told later in the second story that he had once been killed by a mob. At least he tells this of himself. The abbot doesn't know what to make of this, but he tells this of himself. And so what does that mean about this abbey? Well, what is the abbey actually doing in its own frustrating way? It is preserving the memory of the Wandering Jew, who's not a Christian, but they venerate him as a Catholic saint. And he is also most likely the designer of the very nuclear weapons that were used to destroy the earth, the blueprints. Everything, these holy relics, are the blueprints of how to make a nuclear weapon. This is all the irony of this, and it is hilarious and it is wicked all at once. And this is what Miller gives to us, a story that no matter how many times you read it, you are at first going to see the humor, then you're going to see the tragedy, then you're going to see different kinds of humor and different kinds of tragedy. But it will always be a comic tragedy because the story itself is both based on the destruction of humanity and the survival of humanity through the Jewish people and the Christian church. It can survive in every way. So I want you to keep all of that in mind as you are reading Canticle for Leibowitz. It is a great, great story, and there are elements throughout the whole novel that we could look at and look at the various symbolism. So it's not just that the history in a meta, that the novel in a meta sense is important. In a micro page-by-page, scene-by-scene sense, it's also important. And we can dive into some of those scenes. But for now, I want you to just think about what it means that those two things, the Jewish people and the Christian church, are the salvation of humanity. And yet, this is not a history. It is a science fiction. It is what Bradbury tells us, a fantasy about possibilities, a fantasy about free will, a fantasy about choices. And yet, within all of those choices, they always hinge, again, on those two things, the Jewish people and the Christian religion. All right, that's probably a great place to stop. We have gone now close to our 75 minutes here. I'll put this together and post it for tomorrow's lecture. I won't see you guys again until next week. So this is the second of our two classes this week. Please keep reading. I would ask you to start reading the Russell Kirk pieces that we have in the Dropbox. Make sure that you've read Canticle for Leibowitz. Got to start getting ready for the end of the semester. And we will next week pick up a little bit more with Canticle for Leibowitz. But then I want to really get into the rise of conservatism in the 1950s and what's going on with that, with the various figures. We're going to do quite a bit with Russell Kirk. So do start reading many of those documents that we have. Okay, everyone. I miss you guys. I'm praying for you all. I hope you pray for each other. So be good. God bless. And I will see you next week.